Actually, I want to piggyback on the coffee thing just for a second. I know it's not even part of my message. So, I read a book one time, shocker, called, I forgot the name of it. Oh, Enlightenment. And it was like Journey Through Coffee or something like that. And the book, basically, the guy is a historian that wrote this book. And he somehow tries to make a thesis throughout the book and trace the origins of the actual Enlightenment in Europe. You know, when we went from dumping feces out of windows to, ooh, math, but that thing. He went and he traced the origins of coffee coming to Europe right to that point. And he's trying to make the point that people were so wired by the time that coffee showed up in Europe that they stayed up all night coming up with great ideas. And it's a great book. I don't even know if any of it has any founding at all. The guy was really trying to make the point. But I think it's really funny that coffee showed up at the same time as the Enlightenment in Europe. Anyway, I think I'm the only one that thinks that's funny, so I'm going to move on. So, here we go. Speaking of history class, in my 8th grade U.S. history class, I have been privileged throughout the years to teach a lot of kids that are way smarter than me. There's a lot of geniuses that I've been able to teach, and I really look forward to seeing what they do with the world. And one of these guys, his name is, we'll call him James. James was sitting in my U.S. history class, and there was a question that I posed to my history class, and I said, "What do you really think happened at the lost colony of Roanoke, Virginia?" And if you don't know the story, Roanoke was a place where they tried to set up a colony, and it was pretty successful for about 3 years. They kept bringing people over by boat, and for about 3 years, it was a pretty good deal. Roanoke was very successful. All of a sudden, the leader of the colony, he goes back to Europe and says, "Hey, I'm going to bring some more people, don't worry, I'll be back in a little while." He goes back to Europe, gets some more people, they come back over to Roanoke, and months later, from his leaving to coming back, he arrives to find the place in complete disarray. In fact, some accounts state that it looks like clothes were hung out on lines and just left, fires were left unattended, and some burned some houses down. It's as if everybody just vanished into nothing. Clothes were left in neat piles. It's as if everybody just headed for the hills in a hurry. And for a long time, scientists have been trying to find out, and researchers have been trying to find out where all the people from Roanoke went. So, of course, if you watch the show Ancient Aliens, it's probably an episode or something like that with the guy standing there and he's like, "See, aliens." I found out, I did some research about that guy. He's actually, he's also an announcer for WWE, so he's not very qualified. But in the class, I was asking the class, like, "Hey, based on all this evidence, archaeological information, what do you think actually happened?" And they were supposed to be CSI investigators and trace what happened back to a theory. Well, James is sitting there, and apparently he didn't like what his team came up with, and he's kind of a genius. And so he made his own theory, in addition to the one that his team came up with. His team said, "Oh, what if they ran out of food, right? And they made friends with the local tribes in the area. And then they decided to go become part of those tribes because they needed food." Makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? Honestly, it does. He didn't like that. And so he said, "You know what? What if there was a crazier answer?" And so he looked up soil samples from the area, found out that there were a lot of moles living in the area. He then, this has an end, trust me. He then found out that there were a lot of, let's say, plants in the area that produce a psychedelic experience. And he put that all together and he said, "I know what happened, Mr. Barrett." He wrote an entire paper on the fact that, in his opinion, the lost colonists of Roanoke decided to become mole people. And we're living underground to this day. And it was actually pretty compelling. He had a lot of good evidence inside of there. And I was like, can you give a presentation? And it was so great. It was so great and hilarious all at the same time. So mole people, I had never thought of that before, but of course he's a genius. Sometimes, when the logical stuff fails, you need to find another answer. You need to find another way to accomplish the same thing. We have been in Hebrews for a little while. We're now on Hebrews 8. You might have, if you were keeping up with me, and if you're right now calling my bluff, you might say, isn't today's chapter Hebrews 7 today, Jeff. I would say it was going to be, until I read Hebrews 7 again, and I realized, oh, it's just a giant thesis. And I'll tell you about it, but honestly, it sort of reads like if you've ever watched the riveting show called Paint Drying on a Wall. It's kind of like that, or like the back of your eyelids, that kind of thing. But it does play a good part. It's just could be summed up in one paragraph in Hebrews 8, which it is. And so that's what we're going to camp on Hebrews 8. But I'll touch on that. So if you're in, you've got a Bible today, or even if you don't, you can read all that, even though it's a little bit fine print. We're starting Hebrews 8, verse 1. And Hebrews, if you haven't been with us, or you other things have been going on, you forgot, Hebrews is, of course, the book written by an unknown author that for a long time people thought was Paul. People just assumed Paul wrote Hebrews. But it doesn't bear the marks of all the Paul stuff, right? Because when Paul writes something, he always talks about himself, and he talks about his relationship to whatever church he's talking to. He says he has a big, long greeting that usually lasts, a whole page worth of stuff, where he's talking about the good things they're doing, the bad things they're doing, the prayers he's giving for them. Paul really is a really eloquent writer, and the writer of Hebrews gets right to the point. It almost reads a little bit angry, and I kind of like that. It almost reads a little bit angry because the writer of Hebrews is talking to a group of Christians that want to still be Jews, just in case the Romans show up. So if you've been with us there, these people are people kind of straddling both hemispheres and trying to keep up with the Joneses or the Jews, as well as become Christians. And the book of Hebrews is really railing against that kind of thing. So today, we'll talk about the fact that Jesus is the new high priest. And the reason for that, you probably have heard this before, or even if you haven't, you probably go, well, that doesn't make a lot of sense. We don't even have high priests anymore. The reason that this is going to be huge for the people that were straddling the line and being talked about in Hebrews was that they still had high priests. And they still wanted to be, Christian while having high priests, while still being Jewish. And the writer of Hebrews is saying, you can't have a human high priest and still be a follower of the one true God. And trying to make that black and white point. Well, let's start. Now, the main point of what we are saying is this. And this is what, by the way, this next part is exactly what Hebrews 7 is about. So if you want to go back to Hebrews 7, this paragraph is basically it. We do have such a high priest who sat down at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven, and who serves in the sanctuary, the true tabernacle set up by the Lord, not by a mere human being. Hebrews 7 rails on these kind of people because it goes back to a type of priest that they wanted. The order is called the Order of Melchizedek. And Melchizedek was, by all accounts, one of the first high priests that kind of everything that he does is a direct silhouette of what Jesus will become. And so the writer of Hebrews is trying to talk about him because this is something the Jewish people would have gone, oh yes, we know Melchizedek, that's what all our priests are based off of. And so that's where this is coming from. Verse 3, every high priest is appointed to offer both gifts and sacrifices, and so it was necessary for this one also to have something to offer. If he were on earth, he would not be a priest, for there are already priests who offer gifts prescribed by the law. They serve at a sanctuary that is a copy of the shadow of what is in heaven. This is why Moses was warned when he was about to build the tabernacle. See to it that you make everything according to the pattern shown you on the mountain. But in fact, the ministry Jesus has received is as superior to theirs as the covenant of which he is the mediator is superior to the old one, since the new covenant is established on better promises. Wading through all of that, my challenge to you today is to ask yourself the question, do I have an old covenant relationship with my God, or do I have a new covenant relationship with my God? If you've ever been stuck on the treadmill of faith, this is what the treadmill of faith looks like. You get up in the morning, you do your devotional at the regular time, because you have to do the devotional at the regular time, everybody knows that. You have to sit by yourself, or no one can see you, because there's a verse about that or something, and you have to pray just about the same exact prayer, if you're me, because it's usually 5 o'clock when I get to this, and I can't really think that straight when it's 5 o'clock. So I usually end up thanking God for things around my house. The other day I even thanked him for a lamp. But, I thanked him for the lamp, we needed the lamp. The lamp gave light. Anyway, but if you have an Old Covenant relationship with God, there are things you do every single day. And those things aren't subject to change without notice. Those things don't change at all. In fact, you have to do them that way because that's what you've always done. If you have an Old Covenant relationship with God, you talk to the same people about God, which are church people. You have the same group of friends, which are church friends, right? You have that one non-Christian friend that you've been kind of working on, but basically they don't offend them too much because they're your friend. And you get what I'm saying? The treadmill of faith revolves around things I have to do to make God happy. And if that sounds cliche to you today, if you go, no, I don't do that at all. Do you? I do, to a certain extent, right? If I've done something in the day that hasn't been Christ-like, I all of a sudden feel like I need to do a lot of other Jesus things to make up for the thing that I did. It's just the way that we are. We love balancing things. We love checks and balances, and we love making things work. We love things that work out cleanly on both sides of the equation. So if I go to bed at night and I haven't talked to God a lot, I'm going to probably talk to God a lot before I go to bed, because in my mind, I've got minutes rolling, and I go, I haven't talked to God the same amount of minutes that I normally do. I have to get on that. Sometimes I have an Old Covenant relationship with God. But what he's trying to say here in verse 6, but in fact the ministry Jesus has received is as superior to theirs as the covenant of which he is the mediator, and is superior to the old one, since the new covenant, key term here, the new covenant is established on better promises. What kind of better promises is he talking about? The better promises he's talking about is the fact that God is the only one that makes promises he can keep. You see, an Old Covenant relationship is one where you had to perform a covenant a certain way. There is an Abrahamic covenant with the Jews, with God. Abraham made a promise, God made a promise. And that's the way it goes, until we're not able to keep up with the promises of God. It goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden. All that Adam and Eve had to do to avoid getting the entire human race into trouble was not eat the fruit of one tree in the garden. That's all they had to do. Seems like a pretty easy promise to keep. Except that we are people that love to do what we're told not to do. And so they decided to eat the only tree in the garden, from the only tree in the garden that they were not supposed to do. We love to break promises. But then, to make it all right and stuff, they had to come out and go, oh, God, no, we didn't see you. And then all of a sudden, Adam, he has to point blame because it can't be on him, right? So this woman that you put in the garden with me, she's the one that did it. And we had to balance the equation. And when people balance the equation, we never want to call fault to ourselves, because we're not at fault, right? It's that other person. And I didn't spend enough time with God today because my boss was all over my case. And, I had to get this project done and stuff. You understand how it is, God, right? You understand? We love to point blame and then try and balance the equation. But the new covenant is different than that. The new covenant is a promise made to us by God. Us by the one true God who has the right to make promises that he will not keep. I will never leave you nor forsake you is a promise. And it's one that we did not make to God. It's one that he made to us. That's kind of what I'm talking about today. One of the greatest stories I've ever read is one of Ernest Shackleton. And if you don't know who he is, he's an Antarctic explorer that comes from jolly old England. And he decided to first get to the South Pole before anybody else did. And he failed. Because someone else already got there first. A guy from Norway got there first. And so what does Ernest Shackleton decide to do? Well, he decides to do the equivalent of going to the moon back in the early 1900s. He decides to go cross Antarctica just a couple of years after someone actually got there and set foot on it. He decided to one-up him in the greatest way possible. Ernest Shackleton failed to reach the South Pole in 1911. And then, as soon as he decides to get this crew together to go on this voyage, I actually, in his book, which is called Endurance, in his book, he talks about how he would conscript men to follow him. And he had a simple questionnaire. And the questionnaire was an honest questionnaire about a man's life. And it asked all these men, what would you do in this situation? In that situation, it was a personality test. He wanted a personality of a man who would trust him implicitly. It was a man who would trust him with his life and would not do anything if Ernest did not tell him to do it. Finally, he comes up with a crew. He gets a ship called the Endurance, and he decides to head down to Antarctica. Everything is going fine. In fact, the book is pretty boring until about halfway, when finally his ship becomes frozen in an ice floe in 1915. And he's stuck on the South Pole. After a few days, days turn into weeks, weeks almost turn into months, and finally he goes, hey guys, so this is a very large ship, right? Everybody's getting a little claustrophobic. I'll bet there were a few fights that broke out. He said, hey guys, so we need to get off this boat and we need to set up camp to winter on the Arctic, because there's no way we're going to get our boat unlocked from this ice floe until spring. And luckily, in the book, it talks about some things he could eat. They had a bunch of, I guess, seals and sea lions in the area, that kind of thing. And they noticed that the orcas were catching a lot of them, but there were still so many. And so they ate a bunch of that. They had a whole bunch of food stores. And he said, you know what, I think we can last all the way through winter this way. So they camped out on the ice, and they began to try and winter right there in Antarctica, something that had never been done in human history. And he learns a couple things. One, it gets really, really cold in Antarctica. Really cold. And a lot of his men that first wanted to be off the ship now wanted to be back on the ship, because their homes were on the ice. They had made basically igloos on the ice, and just that was where they stayed. And a lot of times the weather in Antarctica, when it gets toward winter, not only does it dip far below any other place temperature-wise on the face of the earth, but there's so many weather patterns that come through that they were locked inside these tiny 25-foot by 25-foot buildings that they had built. And so they began to go stir crazy. In fact, there's some pictures of them doing very odd things. They had a camera, of course, and so they like to document stuff. First, they had a couple soccer games whenever football games, Brittany. Whenever the weather warmed up enough for them to do that. And then you see them actually begin to acclimate to 35 below zero. In fact, they started to do work shirtless in 35 below zero, because it was pretty balmy compared to the rest of the winter, as crazy as that sounds. And as the winter went, all of a sudden, Ernest noticed their biggest problem. Every day, the ship began to list a little bit more to the side, and you kind of see it right there. The Endurance began to tilt. Ernest, at first, would board the ship daily to check on everything, and then he noticed the ship was taking on water. Not necessarily a thing he didn't expect, because it was stuck in ice, but not only was it taking on water, but he noticed that the hull of the ship began to bow in a really, really dangerous way. And then, finally, in the winter of 1915, the ship had a cracking noise to it in the morning. A giant crack was heard throughout the camp. Men jumped up, left their cooking fires alone, and ran out onto the ice to see their ship going down. The Endurance had been lost. And there's actually a video of it. Someone was there and had a video camera, took a video of it. And all you see, and I watched it, it's heartbreaking. All you see are these men just standing there, still, and just looking at their last hope going away. Luckily, Shackleton had thought ahead. He had taken the 2 lifeboats that the ship actually had, and he had placed them onto the ice floe that they were stranded on. And he thought, we might use these for fishing purposes. I don't know. It would just be better to not have all of our eggs in one basket if the ship happens to go down. So he had a boat that was barely big enough for 4 men. And he came up with a crazy idea. He decided to sail a lifeboat 346 miles to a whaling outpost on South Georgia Island. 346 miles away, sailing. He didn't even have a sail. He took a tent that the men were using, and he waterproofed it with seal fat and put it on this boat. He somehow came up with a way to make a mast or something like that and somehow make this into a sailing vessel, and they took off, him and 3 of his closest friends. Not only that might be crazy enough, right? If you heard that story, you might think he's already a hero because he tried to save his men from extinction on the ice. But in fact, he made it. He made it 346 miles to South Georgia Island, and he arrived on the wrong side of the island. He was pretty sure the whaling outpost was on the south side of the island, but it wasn't. It was on the north side of the island, 35 miles away, over a mountain pass. So he did the only thing he could think of. He said, hey guys, we're going to take the night here. In the morning, I don't care who comes with me, but I'm scaling that mountain pass, and I'm going to save our men. And I guess, one by one, the hands all went up, and his other 3 friends decided to join him. And they all made it across South Georgia Island in one piece. In fact, they made it almost in one piece to the whaling station, and the whalers that saw them basically began to pull out weapons to defend themselves, because here's 3 guys, and they are dressed in makeshift sealskin clothing with fur linings, and they looked terrible. I guess they looked like the equivalent of Yeti coming out of the hills and stuff, and yelling at them and waving their arms and saying, we need a boat quickly. That was the first thing that Ernest asked. He said, I need a boat. I need to go back today. And they said, you are in no condition to travel. You are in no condition to go back and save your men right now. But he was so insistent that finally, after 2 days had gone by, they got him a whaling boat. He went back down to the Antarctic, and he saved every one of his men. He got back to learn that he did save every one of the men that were there when he got back, but he came back to learn that a few had passed away, some due to the extreme weather, and some due to the fact that this horrible thing began to happen when they were gone. The ice began to warm up and form little pockets, and they began to learn that the way that a killer whale, an orca, will go about catching a seal or sea lion is they will look for a pocket, which is usually a warmer spot on the ice where a seal will be, and they will ram it with their snout, and actually a seal will fall through, orca will catch them. The same thing began happening to their men. As the fires, they had not really been taking care to move their fires. The fires had been melting the ice and forming those little pockets, and so the orcas were coming up and getting his crewmen that way. But he was able to save every one of the men that was left on that island. He got back, and he had a hard time adjusting to life when he got back, because it was the middle of World War I, and when he had left, World War I had just been a fleeting thought that, you know, this might be over in a few months, that kind of thing, and it was still going on. But Ernest Shackleton did something for his men at risk of his own life that no one else in the party was able or willing to do. And for that, he's remembered as a hero. The old way wasn't going to work anymore. They couldn't make it across Antarctica during the winter. They had to have someone save them. The same thing happened to us. We could not get to God. We needed a Savior. Because, as funny as it might sound, and as strange as it might sound to those that are not a Christian or stuck in the treadmill of faith, you can't do it all on your own, right? You can't cross Antarctica on your own. And we needed a Savior to come pull us out of that. So my question to myself over the past few weeks is, why have I been stuck on the treadmill of faith when God has already saved me? There's already a boat come back for me. Why am I still going, hold on, I can cross this ice myself. I can do it myself. I still want to get to the same place, right? I still want to be a follower of Christ. But I can figure this out myself. And I don't consciously do that. I just know that I want to balance the equation, right? I just want to be closer to God while still feeling like I'm doing something. And the great thing about our faith is that not doing something frees you up to have an incredible ministry. In Hebrews 8, 7 through 13, it says this. For if there had been nothing wrong with that first covenant, no place would have been sought for another. But God found fault with the people and said, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and the people of Judah. It will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors. I'm sorry, this isn't on the screen. When I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, because they did not remain faithful to my covenant, and I turned away from them, declares the Lord. This is the covenant I will establish with the people of Israel. After that time, declares the Lord, I will put my laws in their minds and write them on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. And in this next part, he's not talking about the fact that you shouldn't teach others about Christ, but that he wanted to establish a faith community. Verse 11, no longer will they teach their neighbors, say to one another, know the Lord, because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest. And I will forgive their wickedness, and will remember their sins no more. In verse 13 it says this, by calling this covenant new, he has made the first one obsolete. And what is obsolete and outdated will soon disappear. Have you allowed the old covenant to disappear in your faith today? Are you still living the treadmill of faith and just going, I did this bad thing over here, so what if I made it up by doing all these amazing things? I'm not saying that helping out at VBS is bad, but let's say you signed up for VBS because you know that, I made some bad decisions this year, but you know what? If I do VBS, if I help all these kids, God likes that. Are you stuck there? It's not a bad thing to do good works and do good works for God, but are you doing good works for God to save yourself? Or are you doing good works for God because he's already saved you and you want to save others? So that's my question to you today. What am I doing about this? Well, the past few days have been really interesting with a new year, new students, new stuff happening at work. Every day it's really hard to get into a routine right now. I come home exhausted just because the routine of knowing what to do and have all my kids knowing what to do and being able to just kind of go with the flow is not there yet. We're all kind of treading water right now. So when I get home, it's really hard to switch gears and go straight back into dad mode. And as a lot of you know how that is and have experienced that at one point in your life. How I'm doing it is being intentional with the time that I have with God and leaving prayers open. My prayer this week was, God, will you show me the way to be a man and a father like Jesus was? And it was just that simple. Things began to happen because of that prayer. I began to have meaningful conversations again with kids, other than, hey, sit down, or something like that. I began to have meaningful conversations like, hey, I noticed you had kind of have a frown on your face today. Did you not get enough sleep last night? Well, no. Mom and Dad are fighting again, and I can't sleep. There's too much noise. Or, hey, Mr. Barrett, I didn't get that homework done. Is there a way for me to make it up? I didn't get to sleep last night. Me a couple weeks ago would have been like, come on, get it together. But with the empathy that God's given me the past few weeks, it's gone, sure. When can you get me that assignment? And I've noticed a change come over the classrooms that I teach. I hope that you're able to take advantage of that this week. Let's pray. God, I pray for a new covenant relationship for all of us. And it's a reminder that we all have to have, I think, God, because we always want to balance the equation now. We always want to, do enough things for you that somehow it'll make a difference. But God, that's not why you want us to do good works. That's not it at all. You've established a new covenant with us. You've saved us. And the good works are to point others towards you. God, I pray that you would impact everyone in this room